In a quiet little town where everyone knew each other's stories, there lived a teenage boy named Ethan. He was just like any other 15-year-old kid. He loved playing video games, hanging out with his friends, and dreaming about the future. But beneath his calm exterior, Ethan carried a heavy burden that most kids his age couldn't even imagine. Ethan's life hadn't always been this way. Once upon a time, his family felt whole. His dad worked hard as a supervisor at a construction company while his mom stayed home to take care of things. They weren't rich, but they were happy. Every evening, Ethan's dad would come back from work, tired but smiling, ready to crack jokes or toss a ball around in the backyard. Those moments made their small house feel like the safest place on earth. But all of that changed 2 years ago when something unexpected shattered their lives. One day, police officers showed up at their door. They told them that Ethan's dad had been accused of stealing money from the company he worked for. It didn't make sense to Ethan. His dad wasn't the kind of person who would do something like that. He worked long hours, came home exhausted, and still found time to help people. How could someone accuse him of being a thief? The accusations led to a trial, and it became one of the biggest scandals the town had ever seen. Everyone talked about it, the neighbors, teachers, even strangers at the grocery store. The courtroom was packed every day, with reporters scribbling notes and cameras flashing outside. Ethan remembered sitting beside his mom, clutching her hand tightly, as they listened to witness after witness testify against his father. At first, Ethan held on to hope. He believed that once the truth came out, everything would go back to normal. After all, how could anyone look at his dad and think he was guilty? But as the days went by, the evidence seemed to pile up. Documents were shown, numbers were explained, and witnesses claimed they saw his dad doing suspicious things. Despite his protests, his father was found guilty. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, sentenced him to 10 years in prison. That moment changed everything. Ethan watched as his dad was taken away in handcuffs, tears streaming down both their faces. From that point forward, life felt empty. His mom tried her best to keep things together, but she struggled. She started working odd jobs to pay the bills, often coming home late and too tired to talk. Sometimes Ethan would hear her crying softly in her room. Seeing her like that broke his heart. As for Ethan, he grew up fast. At 13, he should have been worrying about school projects and weekend plans, not whether there was enough food in the fridge. He started taking on part-time jobs, mowing lawns, washing cars, anything he could find to help out. On weekends, he visited his dad in prison. Those visits were bittersweet. Sitting across from his dad through thick glass walls, Ethan tried to act cheerful, telling him funny stories and promising that everything would be okay. But deep down, anger simmered inside him. Anger at the system, anger at the witnesses who lied, and especially anger at the judge who sent his dad away without looking closer at the truth. One night, while helping his mom clean out some old boxes, in the attic, Ethan stumbled upon something that would change everything. Buried under piles of papers and forgotten belongings, he found a folder labeled Dad's Case. Curious, he opened it and started flipping through the documents inside. There were letters from former co-workers, financial records, and handwritten notes his parents had saved during the trial. As he read through them, something caught his attention. A letter from a co-worker saying they had lied under pressure during the trial. Another document showed calculations that didn't match what had been presented in court. Ethan's heart raced. Could these be mistakes? Or worse, could they be lies? For the first time in 2 years, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe his dad really was innocent, and maybe there was a way to prove it. But proving it wouldn't be easy. He needed to gather more information, understand the legal process, and figure out how to present his findings in court. And above all, he needed to face the very same judge who had sentenced his dad. For weeks, Ethan wrestled with fear and doubt. What if no one listened to him? What if he failed and made things worse? But then he thought about his dad behind bars, his mom struggling to hold on, and the injustice that had torn their family apart. Slowly, he began preparing himself for what lay ahead. Little did he know his journey was only beginning, and it would lead him straight into the lion's den. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the folder he'd found. It felt like holding a treasure map, except this wasn't leading to gold. It was pointing toward the truth. He knew he had stumbled onto something important, but he also realized that proving his dad's innocence wouldn't be easy. The legal world was a maze of rules and procedures, and Ethan was just a teenager with no idea where to start. Still, he refused to give up. He owed it to his dad, to his mom, and to himself. First thing Ethan did was dig deeper into the documents. He spent hours poring over every piece of paper in the folder, trying to make sense of what he was reading. Some of it was confusing. Numbers, dates, and technical terms that didn't mean much to him, but he kept at it. One letter stood out, in particular. It was from a former coworker of his dad's who said they had been pressured to lie during the trial. "They told me I'd lose my job if I didn't cooperate," the letter read. "I regret what I did, but I didn't have a choice." That line hit Ethan hard. Someone had forced this person to lie, and nobody had bothered to check if their story was true. It made him furious, but it also gave him hope. If he could find more people like this, maybe he could build a case strong enough to reopen the trial. But how? Ethan didn't know the first thing about the law. He decided to reach out to someone who might. There was an elderly neighbor who lived down the street, an old man who spent most of his time tending to his garden or sitting on his porch reading books. Ethan had always thought of him as quiet and reserved, but one day, while helping carry groceries for the man, he noticed a framed certificate on the wall. It said the man used to work as a paralegal before retiring. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Do you know anything about trials and court cases?" The man raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Why do you ask?" he said. Ethan explained. Everything. The folder, the letters, the possibility that his dad had been wrongfully convicted. To his relief, the man listened patiently and agreed to help. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and the neighbor worked together. They went through the documents, organized the evidence, and even wrote a formal petition asking for a retrial. The neighbor taught Ethan basic legal terms and helped him understand what judges looked for in cases like this. Ethan soaked it all, determined to learn as much as possible. At night, he lay awake thinking about what he would say in court. Would anyone listen to a kid like him? Or would they dismiss him because of his age? One evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, his mom walked in. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her shoulders slumped like she was carrying the weight of the world. Seeing her son buried in legal documents broke her heart. "Ethan," she said softly, "you don't have to do this. You're just a boy." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes filled with determination. "Mom, I'm doing this because I am a boy, because I can't stand seeing Dad locked up for something he didn't do, because we deserve better than this." His words surprised even himself. They came out stronger than he expected. His mom stared at him for a long moment, then pulled him into a tight hug. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll do this together." The day of the hearing finally arrived, and Ethan woke up with a knot in his stomach. He hadn't slept much the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen. Would the judge listen to him? Would anyone care about the evidence he had worked so hard to gather? Or would they just see him as a kid who didn't know what he was talking about? His mom tried her best to reassure him. "You've done everything you can," she said, as they got ready to leave. "No matter what happens today, I'm proud of you." Her words helped calm him a little, but the nerves were still there, buzzing beneath the surface like static electricity. When they arrived at the courthouse, Ethan felt overwhelmed. Reporters milled around outside, cameras clicking and microphones pointed at anyone who walked through the doors. Word had gotten out that a teenager was challenging a high-profile conviction, and everyone wanted to know more. Ethan kept his head down, clutching the folder filled with evidence tightly against his chest. The last thing he needed was attention. He just wanted to get inside and focus on why they were there. The courtroom itself was intimidating. Rows of wooden benches stretched out, and a large bench stood elevated at the front where the judge would sit. People whispered among themselves as Ethan and his mom took their seats near the back. Some glanced at him curiously, while others seemed skeptical. A few even looked sympathetic, but Ethan avoided making eye contact with anyone. He focused instead on the empty chair behind the judge's bench, trying to steady his breathing. Finally, the bailiff called for silence and Judge Holloway entered the room. She moved slowly, deliberately, her black robe flowing behind her. Her sharp eyes scanned the courtroom before settling into her seat. When she spoke, her voice was firm and commanding, silencing any lingering murmurs instantly. Ethan felt his heart race faster. This was it, the moment he'd been preparing for. After some initial formalities, the judge turned her attention to the petition Ethan had filed. "We are here today to address a request for retrial based on newly presented evidence," she announced. Then, almost casually, she added, "The petitioner will now present their case." Ethan froze. His legs felt like lead, but somehow he managed to stand up. Clutching the folder so tightly his knuckles turned white, he made his way to the podium, at the center of the room. Every step felt heavier than the last, and when he finally reached the microphone, his hands trembled visibly. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Your Honor," Ethan began, his voice shaky but clear enough to be heard. He swallowed hard, trying to push past the lump in his throat. "I'm here because I believe my father is innocent, and—" He paused, glancing briefly at his mom, who gave him an encouraging nod. "And I need you to listen." For a moment, no one spoke. All eyes were on Ethan. Judges, lawyers, reporters, spectators. It was unnerving, but he forced himself to keep going. Slowly, he opened the folder and pulled out the documents he had spent weeks organizing. One by one, he laid them out on the podium, explaining each piece of evidence as clearly as he could. He started with the letter from his dad's former co-worker, the one who admitted to lying under pressure. "This person says they were threatened into giving false testimony," Ethan explained, his voice growing stronger. "If that's true, then part of the case against my dad is built on lies." Next, he showed the financial records that contradicted the prosecution's claims. "These numbers don't add up," he said, pointing to specific figures. "My dad couldn't have stolen money that wasn't missing in the first place." As he spoke, Ethan noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere of the room. Some people leaned forward, intrigued by what he was saying. Others exchanged glances, clearly surprised that a teenager could put together such a detailed presentation. Even Judge Holloway seemed more attentive than usual, her pen moving steadily across her notepad as she jotted down notes. But despite his growing confidence, Ethan could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew this wasn't just about presenting facts, it was about convincing people to care, to believe him, to give his dad a second chance. As he wrapped up his argument, his voice cracked slightly with emotion. "I'm not asking for sympathy," he said. "I'm asking for justice. My dad deserves to come home. We all deserve the truth." When he finished speaking, the room fell silent again. For a few seconds, it felt like time had stopped. Then Judge Holloway leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said simply. "The court will review the evidence and reconvene shortly." Ethan returned to his seat, his legs wobbly but his spirit lifted. He had done it. He had told his story, shared his evidence, and stood up for what he believed in. Whether or not it would make a difference remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. As the judge called for a recess, reporters swarmed toward Ethan and his mom, eager to hear more about the boy who dared to challenge the system. But Ethan barely noticed them. His mind was already racing ahead, wondering what the judge would decide, and whether this could finally be the beginning of the end for his family's long nightmare. As the courtroom emptied for the recess, Ethan slumped back into his seat, trying to catch his breath. His heart was still pounding, and his hands trembled as he clutched the folder that had been his lifeline during his presentation. The adrenaline, rush of standing in front of everyone and speaking his truth was wearing off, leaving him drained but also strangely exhilarated. He had done it. He had faced the judge, laid out the evidence, and spoken from the heart. But now came the hardest part, waiting. His mom reached over and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did great," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Her eyes glistened with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness this time, they were tears of pride. Ethan managed a small smile, though his mind was racing. What would happen next? Would the judge take his words seriously, or would she dismiss them like so many others had before? The reporters outside the courtroom buzzed with excitement, eager to get a comment from the teenager who had dared to challenge the system. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward Ethan and his mom as they tried to make their way to a quiet corner. "How does it feel to stand up for your dad?" one reporter asked. "Do you think the judge will listen to you?" Another chimed in. Ethan kept his head down, avoiding their questions. He wasn't here for attention, he was here for justice. His mom stepped in, politely asking the reporters to give them some space. They reluctantly backed off, though a few lingered nearby, hoping to catch another soundbite. Ethan leaned against a wall, trying to steady his breathing. His mind replayed every moment of his speech, analyzing each word he had said. Had he been clear enough? Convincing enough? He thought about the judge's expression, how she had listened intently, jotting down notes, but he couldn't read what she was thinking. Judges were supposed to be impartial, but people were human, and humans made mistakes. What if she dismissed his case simply because he was a kid? The doubt gnawed at him, but then he remembered something his neighbor had told him. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you're scared. Those words echoed in his mind, grounding him. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let fear take over now. When the recess ended, the courtroom slowly filled again. People whispered among themselves, speculating about what might happen next. Some seemed hopeful, while others remained skeptical. As Judge Holloway re-entered the room, the chatter died down instantly. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and began speaking. "I have reviewed the evidence presented today," she said, her tone measured and deliberate. "While I stand by the integrity of this court, I must acknowledge that certain concerns raised warrant further investigation." She paused, scanning the room before continuing. "Therefore, I am authorizing an independent review of the case." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Did this mean, could it really be happening? An independent review was a big deal. It meant someone outside the original trial would look into the new evidence and decide whether it warranted a retrial. It wasn't a guarantee of exoneration, but it was a step forward, a chance to prove his dad's innocence. For a moment, Ethan felt lightheaded. All the late nights, all the frustration and fear suddenly seemed worth it. His mom squeezed his hand tightly, her face breaking into a wide, tearful smile. They exchanged a look that said more than words ever could. "We're closer than we've been in years." But just as Ethan started to allow himself to hope, Judge Holloway added a cautionary note. "Let me be clear," she said sternly. "This is not a declaration of guilt or innocence. It is merely an acknowledgement that additional scrutiny is necessary. The process will take time, and I urge everyone involved to remain patient." Her words brought Ethan back to reality. This wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. There would still be hurdles to overcome, battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they had a real shot. The judge hadn't dismissed him outright, and that alone was a victory. After the hearing concluded, the reporters descended again, eager to capture the story of the brave teenager who had shaken up the legal system. This time, Ethan didn't shy away completely. With his mom by his side, he answered a few questions, keeping his responses short but heartfelt. "I just want my dad to come home," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "He deserves to be free." The media coverage exploded after that. Local news stations ran stories about Ethan's courage, praising him for taking a stand against injustice. Social media lit up with messages of support, with strangers calling him a hero. It was overwhelming, but also encouraging. For so long, Ethan had felt powerless, like no one cared about their families' struggle. Now people were listening, and that gave him strength. That evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his mom, the folder still sitting in front of him, they talked about what came next. The independent review wouldn't happen overnight, and there was still a lot of work to do. They needed to gather more statements, track down witnesses, and prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. But for the first time in years, the future didn't seem so bleak. "We'll get through this," his mom said firmly, squeezing his hand. "Together." Ethan nodded, a spark of determination reigniting within him. He had taken the first step, and now he was ready to keep moving forward. No matter how hard it got, no matter how long it took, he wouldn't stop fighting for his dad. Because deep down, he knew one thing for certain. Justice might be delayed, but it couldn't be denied. Forever. And as he looked at his mom, her face glowing with cautious optimism, Ethan realized something else. He wasn't alone anymore. The weeks following the hearing felt like a strange mix of hope and uncertainty for Ethan. On one hand, the judge's decision to authorize an independent review gave him something he hadn't felt in years, a glimmer of hope. For the first time, it felt like the system might actually work for them instead of against them. But on the other hand, the process was slow, painfully slow, and there were still so many unknowns. Would the review uncover the truth? Would it be enough to overturn the conviction? Or would they hit another dead end? Ethan threw himself into preparing for the next steps. The independent review meant that investigators would take a fresh look at the case, examining all the evidence, including the new documents Ethan had uncovered. But Ethan knew he couldn't just sit back and wait. He needed to keep pushing, keep gathering information, and make sure nothing slipped through the cracks. With help from his mom and their elderly neighbor, Ethan began reaching out to people who had been involved in the original trial. Some of them were hesitant to talk, afraid of stirring up old trouble, but others agreed to meet with him, moved by his determination and the fact that he was willing to fight for his dad despite his young age. One former coworker even admitted that they had lied under pressure during the trial, confirming what Ethan already suspected. "I didn't want to say anything back then," the man said, his voice heavy with guilt. "But I can't live with myself anymore if I don't tell the truth." Each conversation gave Ethan more pieces of the puzzle, more ammunition to prove his dad's innocence, but it wasn't easy. Some days he felt like he was running in circles, chasing leads that went nowhere. Other days he got frustrated when people dismissed him because of his age or told him he was wasting his time. But every setback only made him dig deeper. He reminded himself why he was doing this: for his dad, for his family, and for the simple belief that justice should prevail. Meanwhile, the media attention continued to grow. Local news outlets kept running stories about Ethan's courage, calling him a symbol of resilience and determination. Strangers started reaching out, offering words of encouragement or sharing similar experiences of fighting against wrongful convictions. At first, Ethan found the attention overwhelming. He didn't see himself as a hero. He was just a kid trying to bring his dad home. But over time, he realized how powerful those messages of support could be. They reminded him that he wasn't alone, that there were people rooting for him even if they didn't know him personally. One evening, as Ethan sat at the kitchen table sorting through emails and messages, his mom walked in carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. She set one down in front of him and slid into the chair beside him. "You've been working so hard," she said softly. "Don't forget to take care of yourself too." Ethan smiled faintly, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "I'm okay, Mom. I don't want to mess this up." "Not now." His mom reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "You're not going to mess it up. You've already done more than anyone could have expected. And no matter what happens, your dad will know how much you love him. That's what matters most." Her words stayed with him long after she left the room. Love. It was the driving force behind everything he was doing. It wasn't about proving himself or winning some grand battle. It was about bringing his family back together. That thought kept him grounded, even on the hardest days. As the weeks turned into months, the independent review team began releasing preliminary findings. They confirmed several inconsistencies in the original trial, including discrepancies in financial records and witness testimonies that didn't add up. One report even highlighted how key evidence had been overlooked or ignored entirely. Each new revelation fueled Ethan's hope, but it also brought fresh challenges. Lawyers representing the prosecution argued that reopening the case would set a dangerous precedent, while others claimed the new evidence wasn't strong enough to justify overturning the conviction. Ethan attended every meeting, every hearing, determined to stay involved in the process. Sometimes he felt out of place, a teenager sitting among seasoned attorneys and judges, but he refused to let anyone intimidate him. He spoke clearly, presented his arguments calmly, and never backed down, even when people tried to dismiss him. Slowly but surely, he earned their respect. Even Judge Holloway, who had once seemed so distant and unmovable, began acknowledging his contributions. Then one day, the breakthrough came. A forensic accountant hired by the review team discovered a critical error in the original investigation. The funds allegedly stolen from the construction company had never gone missing. They had simply been misreported due to clerical mistakes. This revelation completely undermined the foundation of the case against Ethan's dad. Without actual evidence of theft, the entire conviction crumbled. When the final report was submitted to the court, Ethan could barely contain his excitement. He and his mom sat in the courtroom, holding hands tightly, as Judge Holloway delivered her verdict. "Based on the findings of the independent review," she announced, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "it is clear that significant errors occurred during the original trial. Therefore, I am vacating the conviction and ordering the immediate release of the defendant." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he hugged his mom, both of them overwhelmed with joy. After 2 long years, their nightmare was finally over. Later that evening, Ethan stood outside the prison gates waiting for his dad. When he saw him walking toward them, dressed in civilian clothes and looking thinner but smiling brighter than ever, Ethan ran to him. They embraced tightly, neither saying a word because none were needed. In that moment, all the pain, frustration, and sleepless nights melted away. Their family was whole again, not perfect, but together. As they drove home, Ethan glanced at his dad in the rearview mirror. His dad caught his eye and gave him a small nod, mouthing the words, "Thank you." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Justice might have been delayed, but it had finally arrived, and it had come because he refused to give up. The days that followed his dad's release were a whirlwind of emotions for Ethan. For the first time in 2 years, their house felt alive again. His dad moved around the kitchen, making breakfast and cracking jokes just like he used to. The sound of his laughter filled the rooms, something Ethan had almost forgotten. It was surreal, like waking up from a bad dream and realizing everything was okay. But beneath the joy, there was an undercurrent of adjustment. 2 years apart had changed all of them, and while they were thrilled to be together again, it wasn't as simple as flipping a switch. Ethan noticed how quiet his dad sometimes became, especially late at night when he thought no one was watching. There were moments when sadness lingered in his eyes, reminders of the life he had lost behind bars. Ethan didn't push him to talk about it. He knew better than anyone what it felt like to carry pain inside. Instead, he focused on small things. Playing board games together, watching movies, or just sitting outside under the stars. Slowly but surely, those little moments began to heal the cracks that prison had left behind. His mom, too, was different now. She laughed more freely, her shoulders lighter without the weight of despair pressing down on her. But she also spent hours organizing photo albums and cleaning out closets as if trying to reclaim the sense of normalcy they had lost. One evening, Ethan found her looking through old pictures, tears streaming down her face. He sat beside her and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We're going to be okay," he said softly. She nodded, leaning into him. "I know," she whispered. "It's just, we've waited so long for this." As weeks turned into months, life started falling into a rhythm again. His dad began working odd jobs to help support the family, refusing to let bitterness hold him back. Neighbors and friends rallied around them, offering encouragement and support. People often stopped by with food or kind words, telling stories about how inspired they were by Ethan's courage. At first, Ethan brushed off the praise. He didn't see himself as extraordinary, but eventually, he realized something important. Maybe he was brave. Maybe standing up for what was right, even when it felt impossible, made him stronger than he ever thought he could be. But Ethan's journey wasn't just about bringing his dad home. It was also about learning who he was and what he stood for. Through the process of fighting for justice, he discovered a passion for helping others who couldn't fight for themselves. He started volunteering at a local community center, tutoring kids and mentoring teenagers who were struggling. Some of them reminded him of himself, the anger, the frustration, the feeling of being powerless, and he wanted to show them that change was possible, even when it seemed hopeless. One day, while working on a group project at school, Ethan shared part of his story with his classmates. They listened intently, their faces shifting from disbelief to admiration as he spoke. When he finished, one of them asked, "Weren't you scared? Weren't you worried no one would listen?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Of course I was scared," he admitted, "but I was more scared of doing nothing. Sometimes you have to take a stand even if you don't think you're ready." That conversation sparked something bigger. His teacher encouraged him to speak at a school assembly, sharing his experience with the entire student body. At first, Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted everyone knowing his personal struggles. But then he realized it might inspire someone else to keep going when times got tough. So he agreed. Standing in front of the auditorium surrounded by hundreds of students, Ethan felt a familiar flutter of nerves. But as he began speaking, his voice grew steadier. He talked about losing his dad, about the sleepless nights spent researching, and about the fear of facing Judge Holloway in court. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He told them exactly how hard it had been. But he also talked about hope, the stubborn belief that things could get better if you refused to give up. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, applause broke out, growing louder until it echoed off the walls. Afterward, several students approached him, thanking him for sharing his story. One girl hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. "My brother's in jail," she whispered. "Everyone says he's guilty, but I know he's not. Hearing your story makes me believe I can do something about it." Her words hit Ethan deeply. If his fight could give someone else the strength to keep going, then every second of it had been worth it. Months later, Judge Holloway made headlines, not because of another controversial ruling, but because she publicly acknowledged her role in Ethan's dad's wrongful conviction. In an interview, she admitted that the case had forced her to reflect on the flaws within the legal system and the importance of listening to voices that are often ignored. "Sometimes justice isn't served in the courtroom," she said. "Sometimes it's served by ordinary people who refuse to stay silent." Her words validated everything Ethan had fought for. It wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about shining a light on a broken system and showing others that change was possible. And while Ethan knew the world wouldn't transform overnight, he believed that every step forward mattered. On the anniversary of his dad's release, Ethan woke up early and went outside to sit on the porch. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. His dad joined him after a while, carrying 2 cups of coffee. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the neighborhood come to life. Finally, his dad broke the quiet. "You know," he said, handing Ethan one of the cups, "you did something amazing. Not just for me, for all of us." Ethan shrugged, embarrassed. "I just did what I had to do." His dad shook his head. "No, son, you did more than that. You reminded me and everyone else that love is stronger than fear, that hope can overcome even the hardest odds. Don't ever forget that." As the morning stretched on, Ethan thought about everything they had been through. It hadn't been easy, and there were still scars that would take time to fade. But they were here now, together, and that was enough. For the first time in years he allowed himself to truly believe in a brighter future. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep fighting, even when the odds feel impossible. And sometimes, against all odds, justice finds its way home.